The new Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook Wild Game Recipes for the Grill, Smoker, Campfire, and Camp Stove is out on April 24th and is available for pre-order now. Here is your book for everything that's best cooked or eaten outside. From grilling to open fire cooking to Dutch ovens to smokers to barbecue to backpacking meals to how to pull off the perfect fish fry, with pit stops along the way for lessons about Ice Age cooking methods and the best 5 ways to construct a cooking fire you can be proud of. And of course, we're focusing on wild game and fish here with over 100 recipes, including stuffed venison burgers 3 ways, wild duck with ahi verde sauce, a jerky made with cola, a gin and tonic made with fire-charred lemons, and grilled frog legs made with a sticky sweet sauce. This ain't your normal cookbook, so be prepared to be surprised. Pre-order your copy now. For more info, visit themeateater.com.
We're giving away the secrets to our method of digitally and physically finding big bucks on public ground.
This mini-series is powered by onX, and we deep dive into what we look for on a map, how we scout it in person, and what pins we use to help us effectively hunt deer.
This is
Public Pins.
Call me the Joker, call me the fool.
Today we are talking about saddles. K.C., tell me this isn't something you put on a horse.
That ain't something you put on a horse. It ain't a diaper that you wear in the woods. It is a landmark. It is a feature on the landscape.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's included in the mustard, mayonnaise, ketchup, ranch dressing acronym that our hunting privates use. But
Hold on. Now, let's do this right.
I think it is a major feature for deer hunting on the landscape.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think that we should probably explain kind of what the saddle is now that we know that they're not things you sit in or on, right?
Yeah, I do believe that, I don't know what came first, the mountain or the horse, but it makes sense to call it a saddle because it's where you would throw the saddle on a horse.
Yeah.
Right? It's the dip in the back, right? So if you look at a ridge line, and there's a little dip of lower elevation, and there's 2 humps on each side of it. Just think like a horse's back, right? You got his shoulders where that are high, and then you got its rear end, its rump that's kind of high. Right in the middle, that sway of the back, like a real old horse. That's what a saddle is. You can find it on a map, actually. Whenever you look on onX, on the topographical layer or the hybrid layer, you can actually find that spot between 2 ridges.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit how to find those on the map. But first, let's talk about, like, what situations do you like to hunt saddles in?
Well,
all situations.
I think really it's going to be a rut thing.
Okay.
A lot of times. I think that there's a lot of deer movement during the rut along saddles because deer run ridges and they also run saddles. So you have a situation where you have intersecting trails, intersecting movements of deer. And I think that's a big one. You actually killed a deer because of a saddle. You weren't actually in the saddle.
Yeah.
But that wasn't a rut situation.
Yeah, it was. So there. Yeah, I guess there. In regards to like a food source, you could do well on a saddle. Say if there was a bunch of white oaks in the saddle that were popping, and dropping their acorns at that time. In this particular situation, the saddle was kind of open country, and the saddle was on a ridge that separated a couple of different canyons. And out of one canyon came a lot of deer. And so they were heading to an ag field at night that was 3/4 of a mile away or so. So they would cross at this saddle and work up through the bottom of this other drainage. And essentially I just put myself, probably 300 yards from that saddle, maybe a little more. And in the line of travel along the trail that those deer coming across that saddle are using. And yes, I did. I killed probably the oldest buck I'll ever kill in my life, actually. Deer that I had a little bit of history with. A buddy of mine tried to kill him in 2015, I think. And I ended up shooting him in 2018. But yeah, it's actually our top viewed video on YouTube, which is crazy because he's just a funky looking old deer with not a very big rack. But anyway, it was definitely saddles are somewhere that you can intercept deer that are traveling long distances. I think is kind of the lesson that we're talking about here. I guess, how do you feel about saddles and hunting them? And if you were to rank it 1 to 10, 1 being the best, how does that rank in your whole arsenal of places to hunt?
Yeah, well, everything's situational, right? You could be in country where saddles are like a thing, but if you just talk about stuff that I use a lot, right? Saddles is pretty low on that list of like these hot spots. It's still a great hunting place, but I just don't hunt a ton of country that is rugged enough to need to hunt saddles in particular. We've been places, and we were places this week that saddles, you could tell, made a big difference. And I think they're good hunting spots, but I think that in a lot of the stuff I do, at least, there are a few things that rank ahead of it, but it's not like I dislike them. I think that in certain situations, it's the thing to do.
I think that saddles, when you match a saddle up with another feature, is when it really gets good.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yeah, so like, if you're using a creek as well or something like that, or a food source or bed to feed or whatever, that, if deer are bedding on ridges, right, you've used those saddles. And I think, for me, I kind of feel the same way. Like, we hunt a lot of kind of flat country. Will Primos calls them Mississippi ridges. They're 6-inch rises, that we're like, oh, that's a ridge over there, And that's kind of where we're from. And we hunt a lot of other areas that are relatively flat as well. But I know that in the past, we've done the Map Scout Challenge. We did that last summer, and OnX was a big part of that as well. And I know there was several places we went that were rugged, like LBL and some of these places that
Oklahoma.
We relied on some saddles to really understand the landscape, the movement across the landscape better. So let's talk about, you mentioned that you can find them on a map, and I think for me and you, they stick out pretty easy. But I know probably several years ago, especially being from a flatter part of the states, they would not be something I could just find using topo, right?
Yeah, this is where I really like the hybrid layer, because I think that if you get that aerial view, it's easier for me to understand what a ridge is. I can just see it because usually it's wooded. It's something you can see. Whereas, like, with just the topo, sometimes it's kind of, especially if there's a lot of squiggly lines on those topo lines, it get a little bit confusing for your average map looker to know which direction what's running and that sort of thing. So I like to look at the hybrid layer and figure out a ridge system. And then on that ridge system, if you ever see a situation where there's like circles or oblong-shaped ovals or something like that, or even a situation where you get a peanut-looking thing.
Yeah, the peanut.
That's going to be a saddle, because what those topographical lines are showing you is that on either side of that ridge, it gets a little bit less slope, or the peak is a little bit lower. So that's how you end up with that peanut thing, right? If the two high points of the saddle, like the butt of the horse and the neck of the horse, end up being taller than 20 feet or whatever the difference is in your elevation lines there, that's when you end up with those little circles that show you that that's a saddle.
Yeah, and you'll see that a lot of times, it'll be the end of the ridge where one of those little circles is, and so that's a good explanation. I think that hopefully will help some people. But you're looking for a peanut shaped kind of deal a lot of times. And that means that the ridge, the ridge has a spot in it that is a little bit lower, which is the saddle, and that causes deer, as we've talked about in the past, that as athletic as they are, they're lazy, and it causes them to cross in that saddle a lot of times.
Do you feel like saddles are good on secondary ridges or primary ridges, or they good on both, or what do you think about that?
Man, I honestly feel like, if I'm thinking about it correctly, and I'm not like a hill country specialist, but the primary ridges, those saddles tend to in my opinion, direct the most traffic.
That's what I think, too, especially for bucks.
Yeah.
If you're buck hunting, a buck's thinking, if I go over that little low spot right there's a whole new mess of does on that other side that I can go check out.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I think that also it's probably a more dramatic saddle on a primary ridge, so it's got more elevation or less elevation gain than you would if you had to go over the very top of the ridge, Got
a little more dip to it.
Yeah, a lot more dip to it. So once you find these things on the map and you decide, I want to go check that saddle out, what are the things you're looking for when you get there in regards to scouting and then thinking about hunting?
Trails, for sure. I think that's the big thing on saddle is that there'll be saddles that the deer don't use at all because it's not advantageous to them because they don't need to go from one side to the other on that spot. Now, pretty much every saddle, if a deer needs to, like for some reason is going that way, it's a better spot than hunting like the toughest, most steepest spot of the mountain, right? But I want to go to a saddle and I want to determine if deer are using it often. And I think that's really the main thing. And, of course, there's always these secondary things of deer sign where, honestly, this week we're actually out scouting in Indiana, and we found a saddle more because we saw rubs there.
Yeah. So they were hanging out there right on that saddle and rubbing a little bit.
We put it together that, why are these rubs here? And we got to looking on the maps like, because there's just a slight saddle right here, and it's kind of where the deer are traveling.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times what you'll find, especially if we're talking about these primary ridges, is that they're big ridges, they're long ridges, and so deer are also are walking down the top of the ridge a lot of times, and there's a pretty good trail going, say, east and west down this ridge, and then there's a saddle trail that goes across the ridge in the saddle that's north and south, and you'll find, X marks the spot, you know what I mean, where you need to be hunting sometimes right there. Also, another thing I like to look for when I'm in there is if that saddle has kind of like secondary ridges that slope down off that saddle and make it really just gradual decline down to the bottoms, you're talking about a money spot, I feel like.
Yeah, and also kind of the inverse of that, I found that saddles that might have like a ravine or something that kind of leads down to it, and it's a spot where a deer can dip down real quick and feel hidden on the backside of it, I also really like those kind of places as well.
Yeah, so in regards to hunting this saddle, are you just sitting right on top of the saddle, right in the middle, or what do you think about when you're hunting this thing?
I'm going to think about wind direction. Of course, we talk about that a lot in this scenario, but in particular, where you're in a place where there are saddles, you're usually dealing with thermals, and that's something you really need to think about. In the evening, thermals are going to fall once it starts cooling down. In the morning, once the sun starts coming up and hitting the bottoms, the air is going to lift and rise. So you need to think about how that thermal interacts with your deer movement and decide where to hang your tree stand or your saddle, this gets real confusing. Yeah, the tree saddle that you're hunting out of, your tree saddle on this terrain feature saddle.
Yeah, so I think if you're thinking about, just as a quick example, if you're thinking about hunting in the evening and your thermals, say the wind's going to be pretty light, your thermals are going to be working for you, they're going to be falling. A lot of times, if you have one of those ditches like you were talking about that leads up kind of to the saddle, you can sit on the edge of that ditch and let it flow down through that in hopes that deer will come up the more gradual side of that saddle, and you're just kind of hunting to just off wind of those deer. Or they could come from the other side of the saddle completely, but you're essentially using one of those ditches to take your wind to a specific location, hopefully away from deer.
I think you need to decide if you're hunting it for rut movement and it's a all-day type sit or a long sit, or if you're hunting like a bed to feed over a saddle. Because if you're hunting a bed to feed over a saddle, you need to be able to set up to shoot deer that are coming from one direction to another. Yeah. Whereas whenever you're rut hunting, you kind of need to just get on the downwind side of that saddle and let it rip, because you don't know which direction they're coming from. And another thing that's complex about saddles is that sometimes you won't be able to see as far one direction or another, so you might need to take that into consideration as well. Since you're in hilly terrain, You know, if you set up too far one direction, you won't be able to see off the other side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think another thing to think about as well is there's one more scenario maybe, or there's probably several more, but there's one that comes to mind where you're hunting white oaks or something on top of the ridge, right, that are putting off. So your actual bed to feed pattern ends up that you're hunting the food source, the feed side of that. And so you might have deer that are sitting, like not moving too much once they get in there. You know, they're sitting in one spot and they're feeding. So you've got to think about like, how can I keep my wind from just sitting right here below me and swirling on top of this ridge or something, the saddle, you know, or something like that. And then you've got to think about also getting shots. You know, you want to be a reasonable distance from the best oaks, the ones that are putting off the most or that have the most deer tracks underneath them. So in other words, maybe those acorns just taste better than the other ones that are 30 yards over here. You know, you got to see if they're smashing these acorns underneath this white oak in particular and be within bow range of that. So let's talk about real quick to wrap this up. How do we mark the stuff that we find in there at the saddle?
I would say that you can pretty much mark something as a saddle when you're map scouting. You don't have to mark it with a white X and say, like, I need to go check this out. You know what a saddle looks like, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that you're probably just going to leave that icon as is when you go in there. But then this is something I'm sure that you'd like to talk about, but you're going to mark the trail. That's going to be the thing that's the most important thing on saddles. You have to mark where the trail is on the saddle.
Yeah, I think and if the ridge has a top trail, if it's a primary ridge with a trail, you want to mark that as well and think about, if deer are, say, bedding on, the end of that saddle, and then you think, well, they're going to walk up to this field that's on the top, on the other end of this ridge. Sorry, they're bedding on the end of the ridge, not the saddle. They're bedding on the end of the ridge, and then the other end has food source on it, and they're walking that direction. You've got to kind of take note of that as well. So marking the trail so that when you go in there, say in the dark or whatever, you know which trail they're going to be coming down, so you know which tree to set up in and where to blow your wind as well.
You probably need to do some checking on those food sources as well while you're there and see if you do have, corn or wheat or beans or whatever else that deer would be moving to. You don't want to set up in a saddle that looks real good when you're scouting in August, but those deer are going to beans, and once they turn yellow in October, they're not going to go there anymore. You know? So you need to make sure there's no seasonal aspects, or not that, but you need to make sure that you are taking advantage of the seasonal aspects. Yes,
exactly, because the saddle can work all year, I think. It just depends. Like I said, you may want to hunt oaks in October, them on top, but then, if you get to late November, the white oaks are just not going to mean anything to them, right? And so at that point, you're thinking, I'm hunting deer that are bedding, or maybe that are in the secondary rut phase and they're cruising pretty hard coming across the saddle, and you're hunting bucks that are doing that. And so, I definitely think if you're marking the white oak, when you're in there in October and you're going to come back in a few days or something, you got the food source icon that you can use, which is a apple-shaped deal. I think
I like the food plot icon. It looks like wheat, and I don't use that for food plots. I use it for ag fields.
Gotcha. Yeah. So a couple of things that you would definitely want to mark when you're in there. You can also mark your access, because a lot of times you're going to want, like, you can't, some of this stuff you can't just scale up the side of the ridge, what I mean? You got to use the saddle or something like that to get up to that point, because it's so steep, or so the soil's just kind of falling off and you can't get good grip. So you definitely want to mark your access and stuff like that too on some of these saddles. But I think that kind of wraps up saddles.
If you're into this kind of stuff and feel like you need more, you can check out our Map Scout Challenge series on YouTube. These are the most comprehensive scouting videos on the internet.
Make sure and subscribe while you're there, and also remember, this is your element.
Live in it.
The new Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook Wild Game Recipes for the Grill, Smoker, Campfire, and Camp Stove is out on April 24th and is available for pre-order now. Here is your book for everything that's best cooked or eaten outside, From grilling to open fire cooking to Dutch ovens to smokers to barbecue to backpacking meals to how to pull off the perfect fish fry, with pit stops along the way for lessons about Ice Age cooking methods and the best 5 ways to construct a cooking fire you can be proud of. And of course, we're focusing on wild game and fish here with over 100 recipes, including stuffed venison burgers 3 ways, wild duck with ahi verde sauce, a jerky made with cola, a gin and tonic made with fire-charred lemons, and grilled frog legs made with a sticky sweet sauce. This ain't your normal cookbook, so be prepared to be surprised. Pre-order your copy now. For more info, visit themeateater.com.